Thank you for being a part of this moment in which I would only come out of quarantine for our distinguished guest today. It's an honor and a privilege and a dream to be with you all today in order to welcome and celebrate our distinguished honoree, the barrier-breaking, path-breaking genius and legendary critic and culture writer, Margo Jefferson, one of my all-time heroes. Yes, that's right. Oh, one of my all-time heroes, and a hero to an entire generation of journalists and scholars and writers. I've been told to keep my introduction short so that we can make the most of a really crisp 60-minute session, and to point you towards the Windham-Campbell program, which includes a brief bio of our honoree, winner of the 2022 Windham-Campbell Prize for Nonfiction Writing. But how can I not gush just a little bit? Margo Jefferson is a masterful storyteller who's writing about, among many things, theater and literature and music and American culture writ large, has revolutionized the art of criticism by turns both analytically daring and exquisitely crafted. She models for those of us who aspire to do criticism a way in which to weave together deft profundities about the work and significance of art in our everyday lives, with the gift for sumptuous prose so gorgeous and lyrical that it rises to the level of rapturous and riveting art in and of itself. Her work also invites us, dare I say, demands of us, to recognize and wrestle with the long-standing entanglements between criticism and memoir in modern letters, and it resoundingly, and as the kids like to say these days, unapologetically, places a Black woman's Bildungsroman at the center of this phenomenon. What a gift, what a revelation to so many, what a truth to those of us who see and hear something familiar to us in her dazzling body of work. Born in Chicago in 1947, Margo Jefferson is a book and theater critic, a former staff writer for the New York Times and Newsweek, and the author of several formidable, critically acclaimed books of nonfiction. 2006's On Michael Jackson, a bold and probing cultural study, which now includes a new, powerful, rigorous, and incisive 2019 introduction. 2015's instant classic Negroland, her first memoir, a sprawling, historically and genealogically rich story of race, class, gender, and becoming. A Bildungsroman, there's that word again, can't get the English PhD out of me. A Bildungsroman of Black girl into womanhood that joins the ranks of literary classics like Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha, and beautifully eccentric literary outliers like Andrea Lee's Sarah Phillips. And this year's remarkable Constructing a Nervous System, a memoir, elegantly dissects the making of the critic, her inner lives and longings. It takes us on the grand adventure of a Black woman's imagination in the making, illuminating the ways in which our opinions, our tastes, our connection to culture are, in and of themselves, always epic events. It's my deep privilege, I feel like I'm going to cry, to welcome Margo Jefferson to Yale and to the Windham-Campbell Festival.
It's a new kind of hug.
Oh, no, we're a mess already. Okay.
All right, now, let me turn this on. Can you all hear?
All right. Is this too loud? It's echoing. Oh.
Through the Beinecke. I love it.
No, it's still too loud.
I had to take it off the mat.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oof. That was terrifying. All right, are we okay now? Yes, we are. I will put it right here. My earring's still on? Yes, okay. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, wonderful Daphne, whom I met years ago when she was at Princeton, and a brilliant young thing who has matured into a brilliant, full-throated, full-bodied critic, who also scholar, and you bring the personal in all kinds of ways, don't you? Yes. All right. Who is the critic? We are writers who think and imagine our way into the art that others make and the cultures that make us all. We are writers who test and remap the boundaries between critical and creative prose, between collective and individual consciousness. These cultures that make and mark and goad and maim and excite us are in flux. And this is one of those discrete words critics like to use that I'm going to try to get past. By flux, I mean contention, crisis, experiment, and transformation. So what is critical authority now, that long craved for, long claimed right to be an omniscient narrator of art and culture? In criticism now, canons fracture and reconfigure, art forms and intellectual disciplines compete and collaborate. So do definition and speculation, theory and reportage, politics and aesthetics. So instead of authority, we should ask, what are the sources of a critical vision? And I don't mean the grandiose permanent one. I mean a vision that's always in process, or visions, and open to revising and revisioning. It's my belief that the arts and cultures we write about today ask that self-scrutiny be part of our process, our critical practice, that we find our way into once protected, shielded, even hidden parts of ourselves, to question our motives, test our knowledge, analyze our reactions, document our contradictions, and probe in public our certainties. How do we do this? Memoir writers and autobiographers are their own leading characters. That's a given. Critics aren't, but we are in our treacherous ways. We are and are not the leading character. Depending on our subject, our approach, our responses, we are also protagonist and antagonist. We are secondary figures offering a little commentary, helping move the plot forward. We're audience members. The novelist, poet, playwright, whatever their text, however far away from their life it appears, we, readers, listeners, spectators, we know and we honor that they are the source, the originator of the work. We critics, we don't bask in that knowledge. Now, I'm not going to launch into one of those time-honored and quite time-worn laments about criticism as a weaker form, because it depends on or doesn't come into being without the art and craft of others. There's a whole body of critical literature that's all about, I'm in a weaker form. I think we're more in these ways like performers, dancers, actors, musicians, who we perform our interpretation, our investigation, our reimagining of a work that exists already. We build structures of thought, feeling, sensory experience onto and into that work. An MFA graduate student said to me last week, well, how can critical authority of any kind really exist, and how can it be called justifiably nonfiction when we know that a piece of criticism is in its way a fiction, an invention? It's based on things that exist in the real world, but so are portraiture and landscape painting, literary realism, documentary film, and postmodern dance, all of which we think of as creative forms. It can be, said this student, utterly convincing, exhilarating, but what's its claim to a non-fictional kind of truth? And then she made sure to qualify truth and nonfiction, as we all anxiously do these days. She was right to ask, here's the critical text, a book, a garden, a TV show, a performance artist drawing the outline of her naked body on a table. We've researched its history, aesthetic, cultural, political. We've taken it in viscerally, or tried to. From a greater remove, we take it in intellectually. We observe its stylistic choices, its traditions, their execution. Then we translate this information into the language that best suits the work as we feel and believe we understand it. Then we fiddle with our perspectives, voice, structure, rhythm. We also fiddle with whom our sense of our audience, not necessarily the artist's audience is, the demands of time and deadlines and space. And here's the rub, maybe the abyss. We translate this information into what best suits the needs, convictions, desires that the work has provoked in us. We translate and we invent. And by invent, I mean we discover in and around ourselves, we find, we come upon. So here are some possibilities for what critical invention is akin to. It's akin to memory. Like memory, its responses are set in motion by facts that are literal and verifiable, but also by fragments of recalled, which is always tricky, memory, association, sensation, experience that can be factually off, even false, but feels emotionally and psychologically essential and very true. Critical invention is akin to adaptation. We immerse ourselves in a work and we recombine its elements. Cut here, reduce there, enlarge elsewhere, change the setting, the language, the effects and affects. Critical invention is akin to improvisation. And I say this, not because I just want to horn in on improvisation, but because we know how an improvisation in music, dance, theater can be created, then and invented, then rehearsed, tested again and again in private, codified, and performed the same way in public again and again. So the improvisation becomes a fixed composition, like a published piece of writing. But it still retains that, intense flair of being of surprise, of the artist coming upon it with such a shock. Why does the autobiographical, the visible, audible, written, spoken act of self-scrutiny matter so? Because most of the performers I'm talking about, they show themselves through the act of interpretation. They don't, have to explain, document in the same way. One thing, which is just crucial, it is a major corrective to centuries of criticism that privileged and elevated the authority of the judge, of a critic as judge, over that of the witness, the artist as witness, the spectators as witness, and the root of witness is to see. So I wouldn't call it freedom from this legacy, but it's a shaking free of its constraints and prohibitions and limitations, and it's a challenge to that burdensome legacy. It's also an act, and this matters just as much, of acknowledging how intimate, whether we are scholars, critics, whatever, students, how intimate our relations to these objects of art, entertainment, material culture are. Often, even when you're a college student, you've rewritten your narrative with a kind of logic and august, honorable intellectual thought of why you fell in love with a particular writer or text, as long as they're considered respectable. But really, it's more complicated and more impulsive than that. And we also fall in love with things that are vulgar and horrible that we're ashamed of, and we still love them. So these intimacies of temperament and upbringing can't be cordoned off from the other forces of upbringing and temperament as they engage with these objects of art. And they can't, those are very strong feelings, and they can't be cordoned off from the other autobiographical forces and impulses that have made us, that go on making us, and that we know, my family, my gender, my race, my geography, my religion. We know how important those are. These matter just as much. And they're as intimate. It's a fascinating task and test for a writer. The personal has so many tones and registers. It can be. And this is why it's an interesting time for memoir. Confessional, contemplative, sly, vehement, raw, clinical, implied, declared. It can break off, into various selves that then conjoin again. So how do we join all that to the kind of fundamentals of criticism, sensory description, intellectual analysis, kind of shapely, reasoned, structural conclusion. So let me take the risk of offering a personal example. It's 1961, and I am in Interlochen, Michigan at the Interlochen Arts Camp. I am a piano and drama major. And I've had my drama class successes. I'd been cast as Charlotte Bronte in a radio play. I was beside myself. A few weeks later, the same teacher cast me, the teachers were all white, as Bernice Sadie Brown, the black housekeeper in Carson McCullers' 1952 play, The Member of the Wedding. It started as a novel, it became a play, and then a movie. The role had been commandeered by Ethel Waters on stage and screen. Waters was in her 50s and mistress of what I thought of as the epically folkloric when she played it. I was a sprightly 12. The play was set in a small southern town. I was from a big northern city. I saw nothing preposterous in any of this, or rather, I refused to acknowledge the preposterousness. I'd been Charlotte Bronte. The same teacher cast me as Berenice. Maybe he'd had an impulse, ham-handed but well-meaning, to give me something of my own, a role that had won acclaim for a member of my race in these early years of, civil rights ardor. I told myself he saw my range. Theater, I felt, was an arena where I could amend and extend myself by inhabiting other identities. A honey-haired white camper played Frankie, the lonely, high-strung girl child cared for by Berenice and played by Julie Harris. On stage and screen, we rehearsed frequently. I rehearsed in solitude so I could practice as well, so I could practice lowering and stretching out my little adolescent girl voice to summon up Ethel Waters. I'd seen the movie on television. I'd seen Julie Harris play nuns and play the ecstatic Joan of Arc. I craved all of Julie Harris's high-voiced intensities and oddities, but they were white waif possessions. It was impossible for me to access them or at least demonstrate them in any public. So I grasped for the harsh and severe grandeur of the epically black that Ethel Waters and Carson McCullers were conspiring to create. I'd seen Ethel Waters in Pinky, too. The thing about her in these later movies and performances, you don't think of Faulkner's They Endured when she's on screen. She endures, and she makes everybody notice it, and she makes some people pay for it. That was very different from what other Negro stalwarts of the screen, like Hattie McDaniel and Louise Beavers, did. That's, I suppose, why I felt I should try. And it wasn't just the better script in this case, it was Waters. She didn't just watch and react to the white characters. You watched her think about them and about herself. Sometimes they revised their responses according to her needs and her mood. I was trying to enter a world tied to my history, but not my autobiography as I understood it. It stirred me mightily, and it was beyond my ken. In that way, maybe I wasn't much different, not as different as I wished to be, from white kids my age who were struggling to play blues or soul music for the same time. Did my deep blues pseudo-Ethel accent sound any better than theirs? Honey, I just don't understand that. I'd practice over and over again, shaking my head in stoic woe. I think it's fair to say probably not. I think it's fair to say no. That passage, with some revisions, minor, is from my memoir, Negroland. So now I'm asking myself, and asking you, what did I leave out? Yes, you knew I wanted to be Frankie. I also wanted to be Frankie's little blonde white boy cousin, John Henry. He was the model of a child star, of a perfect little blonde boy child star, and the obsession with child stars would obviously take me right into perfect black Michael Jackson. But I wanted to be him, and I wanted to be Frankie and John Henry as they were cradled in Ethel Waters' arms. I can remember the avidity with which I watched that on screen. Frankie was cradled in her right arm, the little blonde child in her left. I wanted to be cherished by Ethel Waters in vast American culture and art. And I wanted to be cherished by the audience as she sang, almost absorbed into her, "His eye is on the sparrow" in close-up. I wanted Waters' vocal gifts and emotional powers without any of the sociological class and caste liabilities. My gaze was polymorphous and multivalent. It was greedy, it was needy, it was avid, it was ambitious, and it was craven. Now, no more craven. We go forward to the early 70s and the cultural flowering of feminist and, for our purposes, specifically black feminist art and culture. Black women singers from 1920s and early 30s are blues and vaudeville, Tin Pan Alley, early jazz are starting to be reissued. My mother gives me the first volume of the Bessie Smith Columbia reissue for Christmas. I believe it's 72. Do you remember? Yeah, thank you. Didn't want to be wrong. She suggests that I visit a family friend who has his own collection of these old LPs. I do, and he plays the cheeky and artful Ethel Waters for me. Ethel Waters has Sweet Mama Stringbean, a 20s recording star, a nightclub star, eventually on Broadway. He points out that she's as great as Bessie Smith, drawing on very different tools, means that some scholars and fans, he says, considered her less authentic. They're defining authentic as less Southern, less earthy, seemingly less soulful in timbre and style. Not true, he said. Their voices and temperaments were radically different. There was never, he said, one way to be a blues singer. When her recordings began to be reissued, not so long after, when I was beside myself, that high, sweet voice that can turn growly and edgy in a syllable or two-note phrase, the dramatic precision, the playing with diction, the rolled R's, and then the blue notes, the comic ebullience, each song. Now remember, this is the girl who wanted to be a character actress. Each song is a character portrait. She is her own repertory company. She is a singer, songwriter, dancer, actor, trash-talking comic, and a blues soliloquist. A cheeky mimic and a volatile chameleon, and she's a critic, chronicler, and explicator of the possibilities and traditions these individual black talents offer and claim. She includes white performers, too, mimics, and takes in their timbres and rhythmic styles, folds those styles and techniques into a single song with her black blues, and Tin Pan Alley legacies. Timbre, rhythmic style, all of it. Into dialogues, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes polyphonic, dramas and comedies of diction, of syntax, of the contradictions and clashes and antagonistic cooperations. I think I stole that from Robert O'Meally, of class, race, and gender. Yeah, she's a critic. Ethel, at last you're mine. I've got you. And this is, by the way, something that Daphne Brooks talks about wonderfully in her book. So just another example. I Can't Give You Anything But Love. This is a Dorothy Fields, Jimmy McHugh song that I'm sure some of you know. I can't give you, okay, anything but love, baby. That's the only thing I've plenty of. 1932. She performs the first chorus in the high, trill-smitten voice of a soubrette. It would read to many listeners like white, sophisticated, slightly naughty, but very well-bred diction. It could also be the diction, the voice of Claire Kendry in Nella Larson's passing. Or for that matter, even Irene, who is quoted as saying she admires Ethel Waters. In the second chorus, she does a perfect rendering with her own slight adaptations of Louis Armstrong's jaunty black lover, making a late night visit, as he had recorded it in 1929. So she's playing across all these musical and cultural bar lines and barriers, and she ends, not content only with the vocals, being a vocalist, by singing Louis's final ascending trumpet scale, and she adds an extra note to it that he kind of brilliantly blurs. So this is a glorious comedy of race, class, sex, gender, vocals and instrumentals. It's she does vocal whiteface, vocal blackface, she does vocal femme and vocal butch, because it wouldn't really have to be Louis Armstrong, would it? It could be a very cool, tough woman visiting her at night. So she's doing it all. One could go on, but I want to get talking also with Daphne. I will just make a few other mentions of songs I urge you all to look up. Maybe Not at All is a vaudeville, Not on the First Night, Baby, or Maybe Not at All. I think you get the drift. In which she does, this is again her scholarship and her critical facilities and her awareness of creating, of documenting this evolving and emerging tradition. She does the first chorus as herself. Then she announces she's going to do it as Clara Smith. And a wonderful rendering. It's mimicry, but it's mimicry taken further. She's inside it. It's almost like mimicry as a kind of, let me see, how will I put it? As a kind of musical and performative empathy. So then she does Clara, and then she says, all right, I'm getting ready to do the Empress now, Miss Bessie Smith, Lord. And improbably, because her voice is higher, and not as full, she lowers that voice, you can feel her like putting on pounds, and does Bessie Smith. It's utterly fascinating. One other thing, I think, if only from Ralph Ellison, a number of you must know the song, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, which is crucial to Invisible Man. Louis Armstrong had recorded it first in 1929. It had been debuted in Fats Waller, Andy Rossoff show called Hot Chocolates on Broadway. And by the orders of, supposedly, why not believe it, the gangster Dutch Schultz, he said, I want a comic song about a Negro girl who's too dark to keep her light-skinned man. Make that funny. And, the lyrics, as you know, the chorus lyrics, Rossoff and Waller were able to do more than that, but it's still problematic. The verse, let me just give you a few examples. Here is Ethel, an editor and reviser and new story maker. The original verse, out on the street, shuffling feet, couples passing 2 by 2, while here am I, left high and dry, black, and 'cause I'm black, I'm blue. Browns and yellers all have fellers, gentlemen prefer them light. Wish I could fade, can't make the grade, nothing but dark days in sight. Ethel's revisions. Instead of browns and yellers all have fellows, Miss Sociological Class Colorism and Critic writes, all the race fellas, the W.E.B. Du Bois or James Weldon Johnson types even, all the race fellas crave high yellows. Boing! It explodes. Gentlemen prefer them light. Guess I'm just another, and she almost spits this out, guess I'm just another spade who can't make the grade. Looks like nothing but dark days in sight. And then it goes on through anger, through grief, through does everything Wallace Thurman does in what's the novel called? Black of the Berry, yeah, and more. Anguish, anger, contradiction, abjection, fury, resolution. Enough of that. But there's so much more to be discovered. I think you can see, let me also get back to who are we the critics, the various trajectories by which I came to be fascinated by her. And you can also in certain ways see the difference, the difference between what I'm revealing, when I talk about knowing her, encountering her as a young person, and what I reveal when I create, give her a kind of, which she deserves, triumphant, critical narrative. It's important that you see, that you get as a reader, even if it's implied, not directly narrated as I did, the vulnerabilities, the preferences that in certain ways can be prejudices. In the old days of criticism, this could be a piece that someone would turn into. Ethel versus Bessie. now. And then I could turn everything I said into a kind of, intellectualized, Ethel allows me to play my critic and scholar games, and somehow or another that becomes an upholding of, certain ways of thinking and reasoning and being intellectual, and it slightly X's out these other ways of thinking and being intellectual. So that's one reason these trajectories, direct or indirect, but felt through and talked over with, inside yourself. That's one reason they're important. And also, don't you find that they are kin, what I describe, to the trajectories that move you towards the arts and the artists and the forms that you love most? There's always some these very personal needs and drives, and they're not always rational, impelling you. And then we find the languages for it. They move us towards the arts and artists, the forms and genres that we care enough to make part of our life, to engage with, that we care enough to love, to hate, to ponder, and even to judge, while knowing that judgment is a continuous journey to provisional arrivals. Inside ourselves, inside our prose, and in our relations, which I didn't talk much about, but our relations to our audiences, our readers, it's huge, because of course that's a power negotiation too, as well as our relations to the art. All right, thank you. And now thank you.
And now for talk with Daphne.
Oh my goodness. Can everybody hear me?
Can you hear me?
I feel like we
Are we too loud again?
should never be too. We should be loud in the Beinecke.
You are so.
That's what I'm saying, right?
I do. Be loud in the Beinecke.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, okay.
I feel like we just got an everything, everywhere, all at once, like masterclass on criticism in a way that my head is spinning. I had so many questions for you.
Wonderful.
We want to have time for everyone here to be able to respond to this, really cogent and powerful. And
you know what? Forgive me. My notes are over there.
Oh, that's
and
okay.
I left my pocketbook yesterday somewhere.
The whole
Let
thing.
me just.
It sounds like me.
Yeah, thank you.
On any
Dad.
given
Another
day.
thing we have in common, in addition to the intellectual life of Black feminist sound.
Exactly. Well, maybe. Jesus. Okay. I'd rather just yell. Can y'all hear me if I do that? No. Okay. All right. We're gonna go with technology. We really are. Okay. How's that?
Just like the
Okay,
ladies did
all right,
in the 20s.
yes.
Yeah.
Let's go to the autobiographical place first.
Okay.
Which is so central to the ways in which you've, conveyed the work of the critic. Really, the ways that you've shown how the genres of memoir and criticism, you've exposed the seams of these genres in a way, their imbrications and the ways in which they're indebted to each other and entangled with each other. So that's my reasoning for wanting to ask you more about your way to being a critic. And you talked in the really beautiful Windham-Campbell video interview with you, there was an allusion to you talking about coming to criticism after college, or taking it up as a trade, maybe, let's say.
Yes.
And that it was in the run of socio-political, historical events of the time, of the 60s.
so.
And so I'm interested in how that informed the ways in which you thought of criticism as a line of work, being called to it in that moment.
Yes. No. I get that. It's true. The year after I got out of college, and I got out of college in 68, so this would have
Oh,
been...
wow.
Yeah, 68, 69. So
Yeah.
I wasn't. I was very aware of Black Power.
Yes.
But women's movement, I wasn't fully aware of.
Yes.
But I started. I was looking for some sense of. I felt I'd lost my sense of what my temperament
Yes.
and sensibility were.
Yes,
I'd
yes.
written a lot of nice papers, but yeah. So I needed to galvanize myself, and I still don't quite know why.
Yeah.
I started reading, and I so admired fiction writers. So I started reading the criticism of novelists.
Okay.
I, of course, Ellison. Mary McCarthy may have been the first woman I read. So, clearly I was on the path. Even though she hasn't written that much criticism. Doris Lessing, I remember reading. Baldwin was there.
Yes,
but so,
of course.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
So it really intrigued me. And I thought, okay, there's, I think critics in some way are always, there's an anxious snob streak in you. So I think I was picking fiction writers because a part of me wanted to believe in and invest in, they are giving their time and energy to writing criticism, to thinking about. And, Ellison was great that way because he was so, even if you ended up disagreeing with him, which many, he was so deeply engaged and immersed in these questions of culture and American culture. And kind of fearless in those ways, So that then made me begin to think about journalism. Journalism. And I thought I was trying to decide maybe the next year. I know what happened the next year. 1970, I moved to New York, and feminism, white and black, burst out. So, suddenly every woman I knew, we were thinking about what's our destiny? Not just what am I going to do next? Oh, yes, I'm a secretary at Planned Parenthood. Well, that's fine, but what, where? So that's when I started thinking about, but I can write, I write well. And the thing about criticism that appealed to me was, I thought I can lay claim to these, wildly, roiling and boiling cultural changes. It really, you were so excited that all these black writers and indigenous writers and women writers and bookstores with their own bookstores and were existing, and it's hard to really find the language to recapture how suddenly you were alive, and visible and audible in ways that were compelling.
Well, then you talked about the ways in which to think of the critic in as an ethical line of work in terms of witnessing, and so I was just kind of compelled to think about being called to criticism in this
I like that
moment
connection.
of historical and sociopolitical exigencies that demand a certain kind of ethical way of looking and viewing and participating in a moment.
And it was starting to happen.
Yes.
Historically, I was, quote, lucky because blacks and women, the occasional Latinx person or Asian were being hired for the first time at mainstream magazines and newspapers, which meant I could have a chance, to, as you say, witness, document, bring. And it wasn't always so hard because, in my first years as a critic at Newsweek, with the exception of Toni Morrison or maybe someone like Virginia Woolf, they didn't care about reviewing Toni Cade Bambara or even V.S. Naipaul. So I got this territory. And it made one feel one was not like you weren't a sellout for going to a white magazine.
This context feels really, it's always helpful to hear you in any register, but I always think about, Margo, the ways that your writing is so virtuosic on so many different levels, but specifically in the way that you're able to weave together a kind of very vivid spatio-temporal, historical, series of events that inform whatever the object of inquiry is that you're engaging with. And I'm just kind of interested in how, say, in something like, on Michael Jackson, you're taking us from, Barnum, all the way through Motown, right? And I guess I'm leading towards, I want to ask you a million questions about craft and just the ways that you put together a work like that, like thinking about all of these different kinds of parts that go into and inform this heterogeneous cultural object, you know?
Yes, yes.
So how do you get your arms around it for the young writers in the room?
First I must say also, if we're still talking about, memoir, couldn't be more obvious that the gifts I admired, heterogeneity,
Yes.
mimicry,
Yes,
being
that's
able
right.
to use
That's
all
right.
kinds of
Yes.
narrative styles,
Yes.
voices in Ethel Waters,
Yes. Yeah.
were things that I wanted.
Right.
I must also add, then I'll get back to style,
Yep.
that
Yep.
her virtuosity at what one would call different kinds of dictions and syntax
Yes.
across racial lines
Yeah.
was something I was always
Yes.
anxious about with
Yes.
myself. And so, the beauty of her being able to do it
Yes.
was, in fact, inspirational in
Right.
terms of what I might try to do in writing.
Yes. Yes.
And my old having wanted to be an actress, I
Right.
think, had a lot to do with that
Yeah.
too. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that then.
No,
About
we can go back to craft.
Okay,
but
right,
yeah.
craft and style, right?
Right,
So
yes.
we can hang out with that. But the ways that the theatrical matters to you
Oh my
as
God.
form as well as content.
Yes,
in your
absolutely.
criticism.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Michael Jackson was wonderful for me, though.
Yeah.
The horrors emerged,
Yes.
eventually, because, his traumas were so
Yes.
wildly theatrical. Every
Yes.
part of his life
Yes.
was a theatrical
Right.
spectacle
Right.
or
Right.
tragic family drama,
Right. Yes.
or it was part of the black entertainment tradition. And he could inhabit, as I'm sure you all remember, all of those.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Even the performances.
Yes.
Okay, here's Fred Astaire, here's Sammy Davis Jr. Oh, you know what, my jacket, it's like what Judy Garland used to wear. Oh,
Right.
okay, I can give you a James Brown move,
Right, right.
And that was so trying to do justice to all those
Yes.
tones and,
Yes.
and styles and modes
Right.
and needs
Yes.
also
Would
was
you
extremely interesting.
Yes. So,
But I just started with themes.
Right.
Well, I knew I've
Right.
always been obsessed. Going back to Brandon DeWilde with
Yeah,
child stars.
yeah.
No, going back to 30s people like Freddie
Right.
Bartholomew. I mean,
yeah, sure,
right?
right.
Or Little
Right,
Dicky,
right.
Little Dicky Moore.
Oh my God, Little Dicky Moore.
Oh,
Okay.
you knew the Moore.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I mean, this comes up in your work.
Margaret
right? Yeah.
O'Brien.
Yeah, right.
Okay, there we are. So, yeah.
So, I guess
Where
I'm
were we?
also I'm
Right.
fascinated by and I want to be careful. I'm like a performance-based scholar. I want to be careful with how I use this word. But the theatricality of your own prose, or the self-conscious ways in which performance and performativity figure into the ways that you think about criticism and incorporate criticism as an object of inquiry in the process of writing criticism. Is this making sense?
Yes,
Is this
yes.
making sense?
It's
I don't
making
know, I don't
sense.
know. I think
I don't have an answer yet, but
Yeah.
it's making sense.
there's a way that your writing is well, it's doing so many things on an intersectional level in terms of taking up space and claiming a kind of space and privilege that's only historically been allowed white men
Okay.
to claim a kind of
All right, so
speakerly
that's
voice.
part of the theatricality.
Yes, that's what
which
I'm talking
is
about.
yes.
Yeah.
I think it's partly, what one has inherited. When I was growing up, there really weren't, black
Yes.
writers,
Right.
women writers were not really part of the canon.
Yes.
So one does absorb, if you love
Yeah.
literature,
Yeah.
all sorts of modes
Yeah.
of
Yes.
authority, of comedy,
Yes.
and you start imitating. They're in
Yes.
your repertoire.
Yes,
You know,
right,
there are
yeah.
times, for example,
Right.
I'll pick someone who's kind of progressive, albeit a patriarch, when I would need, I just felt I need a certain kind of performative certainty that is also not reactionary, and I would
Yes.
turn to a George Bernard Shaw
Okay.
piece,
Yeah, sure.
because
Yes.
of that.
yeah.
When I
Yeah.
needed to be intense about something, like
Yes.
let's say Black diction and Shakespeare,
Right.
but also kind of sly.
Yeah,
I might
sly. I use that as a word for your writing all the time.
Oh, okay.
It's super sly.
Super sly. Oh, okay.
It's super sly.
Super sly.
Keep going. I'm sorry. I'm getting excited.
Ellison is useful in that
Yes,
way.
yes.
Partly because of also the intensity of what he holds back, that almost represses.
Right.
Can be interesting too. I had to be careful with that because that's so much a part of the way I grew up. Anyway, yeah.
Sure, but in Ellison also, Chehaw Station Ellison is all about, I'm going to pop up. As a Black person, you're not going to expect me to be here, but I'm going to be here witnessing and holding all this knowledge about classical music, about the folk, being at the crossroads.
So
right?
there is that also deliberate, which I know you do as well, the interplay between, let's say, a white literary allusion and the black text or, the high, so-called high and that you're not showing off. Well, no, maybe you are showing off. Not always calling attention to, but always making sure that it's there for some reader to get.
Right, exactly.
It's like these secret messages to different readers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And calling attention to the irony and the spectacle of showing up in these places that we're not expected to be and have any kind of authority over. Being able to have opinions and tastes and passions about Bing Crosby, for instance, who you write about in constructing a nervous system, right?
Yeah.
So
one had to find a way.
Yes.
Why am I obsessed with Bing Crosby? I make fun of him all the time.
Right.
And yet the obsession remains.
Yes.
So it took me, I actually did a little performance piece. It was very short on Bing Crosby some years ago. And that was in some way to get...
See?
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about.
To get it out there. But
right.
I'm trying to remember how I found my way to Condoleezza Rice and George Bush. What finally I got was that, as I put it in the book, everyone needs a minstrel. Everyone needs some figure, whatever your cultural position, whom you can, they've got something kind of vulgar and exciting that you might want to borrow from, but you also disdain and look down on them.
Yes.
And I think I said Oprah had Dr. Phil.
Yes. Right.
Condoleezza had George Bush. We don't respect how she used her intelligence, but it functioned as opposed to his. It was there, right? It was some kind of entitlement. His entitlement, I think, was being a cheerleader at Yale. Wasn't that part of what he was? So, that finding a kind of comic, but serious tradition for this, and just thinking about turning the tables, the topsy-turvy, psychic thing of needing a minstrel. And that allowed me to get, I think, the tones I needed for Bing Crosby. Also, Bing Crosby, in his own slightly oleaginous way, he was a big fan of Ethel Waters', and he loved to do a simpler version of what she did, which was, I'm being very mellow now, and now I'm going to get down and be, he was with Paul Whiteman, the Rhythm Boys, and his thing was to do the hot black version. This was very popular in those days, and then the sweet crooner version. So, okay. But what happens when you watch someone who's not you do that? But, I'd like to write more about Sammy Davis Jr. because he was a great mimic.
Yes.
And that was dangerous when he would show up on those TV shows doing Cary Grant. Some people loved it and some people really didn't. Yeah.
Right. This is really a mapping of cultural encounters and intimacies, which is a word that you used in your beautiful remarks, right? And being able to think about and take apart the ways in which criticism really is about this kind of staging of encounters.
That's
and
great.
Sometimes
Staging.
Collaborations and sometimes combative kinds of forms
and
of
always
contact.
to some extent, one is manipulating.
Yes, right. That's right.
I will find a way to make this.
Yes, exactly. I know that we're running short on time, which kills me. We could do this, and I'm sure people have tons of questions. I want to selfishly just maybe say one more thing. I want to do more things. If we had more time, I'd want to talk to you about Ella just made her too. I just did a neologism.
She loved.
She did.
She loved Ethel
Ethel
Waters.
Right,
That's right.
Ella Fitzgerald, and The Politics and Poetics of Sweat, which you write about in
Right.
just these prodigious ways in the book.
Again, the things that I had to include, the ways in
Yes.
which sweat had terrified and repelled me as
Yes,
a child.
right.
You know, that was part of the story.
And
yeah.
it becomes a kind of a way in which to talk more broadly about artistic labor, right?
Yeah,
And,
yes.
right?
Well, let's find a
Yeah.
use for William Butler
Yes,
Yeats, whom we
right.
once adored, but now he has to be
Right.
quoted. We
Right.
can sneak in
Right.
still
That's
liking
right.
the poetry,
Yes.
but we can
Adam's
critique
curse,
it.
right? To be born woman is to know, although they do not talk of it at school, that we must labor to be beautiful, right?
Yeah.
But it becomes this, beautiful meditation on the work of the critic as well here.
Okay.
At least that's
Thank
what
you. No, I like
felt
that.
like I was feeling that.
Good, I'll take that.
Okay. So I just want to share very quickly my favorite line in the book, and it opens out onto a longer paragraph, which I don't have time for. I like to claim there's power in learning to imagine what hasn't, can't, and won't imagine you, right? And I just feel like that's just such a gorgeous invitation to break into things, if I can kind of, offer a little bit of insurgency here, to be able to break
Please,
into
no,
these spaces.
exactly, because it can be,
Yes.
it has that ashamed and abject
Yeah.
side, and then the assertion,
Yes.
but it's still, you're right, you need the insurgency
Oh,
to
yeah.
take that assertion somewhat
It's the
forward.
story of my life, listening to punk rock in Menlo Park in
God.
Palo Alto, California.
There we
I
go.
didn't know
Okay,
about
see,
it,
confession,
right?
there it
Yeah,
is.
no, so, I think that, Margo, you're, I'm going to open up to Q&A. We'll just say your work invites us to be brave as thinkers and writers, and to be witnesses, to use that word one more time. And it's such a generous project across your whole body of work. So with that, I want to open the floor, with the little time that we have left, to any questions that folks may have in the audience for our distinguished guest. People need to take a minute. Yeah, yes.
How has criticism changed since you started?
Oh God, well there are 1,000 more voices and 1,000 more outlets, just like multiple more. And an absolute claiming of, look at someone like Hanif Abdurraqi, but I'm a poet, I'm a critic who's also a participant observer. And I make no bones about that. This is all, the center space, as if I were a novelist or a poet. And there are, all kinds of styles like that now.
Other questions?
And it helps that the essay, as a literary form, has
Yes.
become
That's great.
much more powerful
Yes.
and honored and popular. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, that's a beautiful point. Yeah. Students in the house who are feeling inspired, young writers, junior scholars. Yes, there's somebody there.
I was curious, talking about your experience as an actor when you were young, and how that impacted your criticism. In terms of writing and prose and craft, how did embodying monologues and scripts affect the way that you approach telling a story on the page?
Well, monologues are extremely good for getting close up the voice, audibly, the voice of a very particular character.
Yes.
And, or a soliloquy, with different intentions, but still, yeah, and the absolute centrality of the need and of what that character wants to say, and of trying to find, as a critic, I'm not a playwright, I'm a critic, trying to find rhythms, tones, timbres that will at least imply, welcome up. When I started writing memoir, I didn't need it so much in my reviews. I really started studying closely, how scenes were constructed, and also different ways of sustaining an arc of tension. I remember how important that was, for example, not even with the first memoir, with the Michael Jackson book, So that would be, It's a good question.
Time for maybe one more question. Yes, hi.
Hi, I'm actually a student, and I was just wondering, I've read all your stuff about music and writing about arts and culture, and I'm also a
making connections like,
Connections about like humanity and society, like structures, and like what's that bridge for you between like art and then
you know, probably because if I had it to do over again, in my day you had American studies was literature and history, you know, and at the very end, blacks and women were coming in. But now, you know, cultural studies, that is what I would have done, this intellectual combining and juxtaposition of and conversations between. So what I did when I actually got out of college with all this English, I really undertook to you know, as much as I could, train myself in, you know, reading, you know, history and a certain even, oh God, theory. It almost killed me. It makes you feel so, oh, I'm so down, but I'm going to keep trying. You know, I have a lot of friends who are in other disciplines. And I would even, when I was reviewing, I'd say, you know, what do I need? Okay, from your field, what do I really need to know to do this? You know, not as like a sudden expert, but as an intelligent, common reader kind of reviewer. So, you know, making up in a sense for what I didn't think to pursue initially, and didn't go to graduate school for. Yeah.
I'm also struck by the ways that, in response to this wonderful question about thinking about the larger stakes of one's writing in relation to community and
Yes.
you know, world making, that you've mastered a kind of toggling between the first person singular and the first person collective.
Yeah.
That is really very resonant and provocative, and thinking about, you know, hearing the we and the I, as Hazel Carvey had quoted John Coltrane at the end of her, you know, path-breaking piece on blues women's musicking.
Yes.
But that's the way that I also think about your prose, is kind of moving between the I and the we and hearing
Absolutely.
one and the other.
And that is also something, you know, again, when one entered criticism, and my first full-time job was at Newsweek. You almost never said I.
Right.
There was also just certain temperature
Yes.
in terms of the tone.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm kind of wry, but
Yeah.
I'm interested.
Yeah.
And, you know, so also I was entering again, you know, journalism too, counterculture journalism and radical journalism. We were challenging all of that. So who in God's name was we?
Yeah.
You know, what
Yeah.
we are you talking
Yes.
about?
Yes.
And how does one find an interesting, fluid, but intense eye? So that
Yes.
was part of one's education. And you
Absolutely.
can't not think about that when you're in like mass media,
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
can drown you
Yeah.
in its presumptions and assumptions
Yeah.
of what that means.
Yeah. Well, we are
was
indebted to you, Margo Jefferson, for paving the way forward in critical letters and luminous writing that
I'm
keeps us
very
hopeful.
proud if you feel I had something to do with the work you're doing.
Oh, please.
You're my, you know.
Let's do this at the end here. I said to you when I came in, I was like, it's like Denzel at the Oscars when Sidney was also getting his special trophy, and Denzel got up and said, Sidney, I'll always be chasing you. So that's just
Which
me
also
to you.
means doing things that I
Yeah.
don't do and that I can't do. That's how the legacy continues that you
Here
are
we go.
doing.
Here we go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Margo Jefferson.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
for coming.